Constitutional Conversations is a series of discussions by America's leading scholars about the principles, framing, ratification, and implementation of constitutional government in the United States. This series is hosted by the James Madison Memorial Fellowship Foundation of Alexandria, Virginia.
Welcome to the latest Constitutional Conversation, hosted by the federal government's James Madison Foundation, an independent agency created by Congress during the bicentennial of the Constitution and devoted to the dissemination and knowledge of the United States Constitution. This multi-year series has captured on film some of the foremost scholars of American constitutional history, and today we're privileged to host the acclaimed biographer Stacy Schiff. She is the author of 6 books, including Vera, Mrs. Vladimir Nabokov, winner of the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 2000, and 2 books on Boston natives Samuel Adams and Benjamin Franklin. Today we'll at least begin with A Great Improvisation, Franklin, France, and the Birth of America, 2005, on which the recent, and we're recording in June of 2024, television miniseries Franklin, starring Michael Douglas and co-executive produced by our guest, was based. And we'll see where the conversation goes from here. Stacy Schiff, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. Delighted to join you.
Well, let's begin with the title, shall we? Improvisation, that's a theatrical word, it's a musical word, and Franklin was both. He composed music for string quartets, and he innovated a design of an instrument called the glass harmonica, which makes an appearance in Franklin. And he was a great political thespian. What were some of the improvisational aspects, in your opinion, of those diplomatic years in France? And what character traits suited him to the role he played? For example, he really did play that role. The rusticated Franklin struck the Comte de Vergennes as antiquity incarnate. And if I may, I want to quote a little bit from Vergennes, who also pals around with the Marquis de Lafayette in Franklin. Quote, "It was as though the simplicity of the classical world, a republican of the age of Cato or Fabius, had suddenly been brought by magic into our effeminate and slavish age, the 18th century." The simplicity of the classical world. And yet Franklin was anything but simple. So if you would, talk to us about that ability to act a part and play a role.
Let me return to the simplicity. First, let me start with the title question. There is as yet no America when Franklin sails for France in 1776, and therefore there is no American foreign service. So from the beginning, he's inventing a foreign service really out of whole cloth. The committee that dispatches him is called the Committee for Secret Correspondence. It's a name that Franklin regularly bungles, but it very quickly turns into the Committee for Foreign Affairs, a name that he doesn't even hear for, I think, 6 or 8 months. So poor is correspondence between Congress and Franklin in Paris. So already you have this issue with just how to get word from Congress to its representative in Paris. And Franklin essentially is saying, after months and months, I have no instructions, what am I meant to do? And Congress saying, after months and months, we haven't heard from you, what are you up to? Largely because the missives that are going back and forth are landing either with the British or at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So he's not only in a foreign world where he speaks the language in a rather rudimentary fashion, but he is without at least current instructions. He has his original orders, obviously. And he's on a very tricky errand. He's on an errand which is to solicit help from a monarchy and founding a republic, which is not exactly the world's most obvious assignment. So he's at odds with his world. He doesn't know the etiquette. He doesn't really speak the language fluently. He's having to sort of grope his way along, not knowing entirely whom to trust. He's surrounded by spies and informers, doesn't necessarily know who is exactly a spy and who is not, and he essentially assumes that everyone is a spy. As he puts it, if my valet was a spy and I liked him, I would keep him on the assumption that at least I liked the man. And he just essentially has to invent this thing on his own with a crew of colleagues with whom he doesn't always get along perfectly, and with a crew of sort of colorful French characters at his side. To your point about the great simplicity, indeed he lands in France as if he's a sort of joint creation of Voltaire and Rousseau. He's this backwoods frontier philosopher in the eyes of the French. As we know, Franklin never lived anywhere but a large town or a city in his life. But he seems to have sort of rumbled in as this image of this brand new thing, this American, whatever that was. And with both that rustic appeal and with the very sort of antithetical appeal of a great philosopher, because he is known to be the man who tamed the lightning. And he will exploit that celebrity at every juncture. He's the most celebrated man in Paris. And so he's able to sort of really use that mileage with the backwoods philosopher, the sort of rustic statesman, the man who wears this, crazy marten fur hat on his head throughout the drawing rooms of Paris, to the advantage of this nascent republic.
Do you think he was playing that up to step into the role of sort of frontier philosophe or something like that, to charm the French and to further his diplomatic aims, or is he up to something else?
I think he knows the currency that he represents and that he can use. He knows he's on something of a PR mission. From the beginning, he's a champion propagandist, by which I mean that he's selling the French court to the Americans, many of whom are hesitant about this idea. Why are we soliciting aid from one monarch when we're trying to throw off the bonds of another? And also selling the Americans to the French, who really can't necessarily locate the American colonies on a map and are very unconvinced that an American republic is something that has any validity or at least any possibility of enduring. So he's got a double PR mission on his hands. And yes, I think he uses the celebrity to great advantage. He sits for a ridiculous number of portraits in those years. He complains about it, but he does it. And I think, and says to his family, my face is as well known as the moon at a certain point. But he doesn't mind the circulation of these, little porcelain images of him or the multiple portraits that he sees. I mean, his image is immediately on walking sticks and candy dishes and wallpapers. It's hard to escape at a certain point. I think it's hard for
chamber pots occasionally too.
I'm sorry.
Chamber pots too.
I think it's from John Adams. It's from John Adams, and that's the only citation of it I've ever seen, and I sort of avoided it because I wasn't sure if it was actually true, because it was so much in keeping with John Adams's view of Franklin, which obviously we can talk about. But yes, I think he exploits the celebrity tremendously, knowing that it's to America's advantage and to his advantage in terms of getting into the drawing rooms he needs to walk into to essentially twist the arms he needs to twist at the French court.
You mentioned Franklin's role as a philosopher. And that's exactly the right word to use, because natural philosophers, how people in the 18th century referred to scientists. And it just occurs to me that Franklin is such a remarkable character. How do we explain him? A man with no antecedents, born the youngest of 10 sons, I believe, to a candle maker, once an indentured servant, who, by the time of his death, is perhaps the most famous man in the Western world. He's a true Enlightenment polymath, a printer, a writer, an inventor, a philosopher, as you said, a statesman, cunning diplomat. What accounts for such a life? Could he have become what he did become if he had been born elsewhere, if he'd been born in Bordeaux rather than Boston, for example?
An early biographer, I think, addresses that question brilliantly when he says, Franklin is one of 17 children. How is it possible that this eagle was born in a hen's nest? He's so much far and beyond his siblings. How do you account for this? Franklin is always interested in the fresh idea. He's never bound. He's not hidebound in any way. He's endlessly not only inventive but curious. He's an omnicurious individual and has an astonishing ability really throughout the life, and it's a long life, to embrace change. And I'm not saying that that's the secret to his success in any way. I don't think we've been able to put our finger on or bottle the success of Benjamin Franklin. But there is a limberness there. There's an elasticity of ideas. I mean, he isn't an immediate patriot, as we know. He's a late convert to the cause of independence. But when he makes up his mind, it's a full embrace of this new idea. And I think that's partly what we can write down his success in the sciences too, certainly. Could that kind of thing have happened elsewhere? Absolutely not. America was the only place I think probably it could have happened at that point. There's much discussion in the French years of how this, His Excellency Benjamin Franklin was once a printer's apprentice, and how unlikely a story that is, and how that could never have happened in France when printers' apprentices never really got beyond the print shop, where everything was hierarchical and you belonged always to the social stratum to which you were born. Interestingly, Franklin will get in a little bit of trouble with friends toward the end of the French stay. He's always beleaguered from the get-go by people who would like to move to America. Some of these are people who would like to fight for the American cause. Some of these are people who see America as what it will become, as a land of opportunity. Some of these were people who were running from multiple wives. There are many reasons why people wanted to remove to America. And he writes a pamphlet which is advice to those who would remove to America. And he essentially says, and he sets down sort of a definition of America as this beacon of opportunity, as a place where people don't ask who you are, but what you do, and how industry and diligence are what matter here, not pedigree and the level to which you were born. And his friends basically say to him, maybe don't publish that right now, because those ideas were so heretical in 18th century France, and he doesn't, in fact, distribute the pamphlet until later. But there is this sense that he is freed in a way, partly, I would say, by the fact that he doesn't have a university education. He's entirely self-educated, right? So that, too, leaves him, in a funny way, a little freer to experiment. And he's from the beginning, he is a voracious reader, where he will, trade his dinner money for books, and who essentially feels that books are his best friends as they remain throughout his life.
Despite his high reputation in America, by 1778, some of his countrymen had begun to doubt Franklin's fitness for the job, I suppose partly because he wasn't particularly good at the correspondence. John Adams, for example, despite having served with Franklin on the subcommittee that drafted the Declaration of Independence, especially doubted Franklin's fitness and wasn't shy about voicing those doubts. But the ironic Franklin managed to hold Adams at a distance, at arm's length. You call Adams vain and graceless, I think, and that's exactly the right way to denominate him. So if you would, could you tell us about the relationship between those two Boston natives, Franklin and Adams, and between them and their French hosts during those critical months that they spent in France together?
I guess the short answer is this is the ultimate odd couple in American history. I mean, these are two bookish sons of Massachusetts. They're born 12 miles apart. They have everything in common. They have deep respect for each other before the French years. John Adams will land in France without as much of a portfolio as Franklin, and very quickly allergic to the kind of celebrity he sees his colleague Benjamin Franklin enjoying. And with all due respect, and I adore John Adams, he's a vain man. So this does rub him the wrong way. And I think the best way to illustrate the difference between the two of them and the different attitudes they adopt toward the French is by looking at how they attempt to master the French language. And Franklin's feeling on this was he knew his French was imperfect, he knew he had a major mission to accomplish, and he went out as much as possible and spoke pretty fractured French when he needed to, and essentially assumed he had his own personal gravity was going to carry him to the end of the sentence. John Adams, a perfectionist of the first rank, holed himself up in his room and tried to teach himself French from books, with the obvious result that he had no one to talk to, and therefore resented Franklin for the mediocrity of his French. He had thought Franklin was fluent in French. He arrives in France, he discovers that this old man is really kind of bumbling his way along, and people are complimenting him all the same on his very mediocre French. And this just rubs John Adams entirely the wrong way. He doesn't really understand, or doesn't really feel that there should be as much gratitude expressed toward the French court as he sees Franklin posturing. Feels very strongly that demands should be made rather than requests submitted. So the two of them just see this posture of the supplicant very differently. And John Adams manages to really botch the relations with Versailles, which are obviously very tender because Franklin is constantly making the trip to Versailles or sending requests through various emissaries, requesting more money, submitting long shopping lists for everything that Washington's army needs, and just on bended knee hoping that he will get what he's requested. And John Adams really is a little bit of a bull in a china shop in the sense that he barges in and essentially says, look, it's in your best interest to France to bankroll us. This is, this is for you that we're doing this. You have a lot to gain here. We need a navy immediately. And needless to say, the French court essentially says to Franklin, we'd rather not ever deal with your friend Mr. Adams again, which creates tremendous ill will. And John Adams winds up, to our advantage, with not a great deal to do, but with what seems to be a tremendous selection of pens. And he writes over and over back to various correspondents and to Abigail in America about the dissolute Dr. Franklin, in part as well because he doesn't understand that the way that Franklin is working his diplomacy is largely in the drawing rooms of Paris, in the salons of Paris. And he thinks that Franklin is essentially a frivolous lightweight who's spending his time going to the opera, when in fact Franklin is doing what ambassadors have done, since his time. Anyway, so the result that we get are these blistering letters from John Adams about how Franklin is a lecherous old dissolute, and very little on Franklin's part because Franklin generally doesn't engage with his enemies about John Adams and the damage that he's done at court until Franklin is ultimately forced to say to Congress, we have a problem here, you have to sort of keep John Adams from Versailles.
Fascinating characters both, I think. Indeed, the book is filled with fascinating characters. None less, I think, than Caron de Beaumarchais. The playwright, the brains behind that shadowy Hortelez and Company, no mean actor himself. So what roles did he play, Beaumarchais, in the covert operations that armed Americans and in the negotiations with France that led finally to that alliance?
So Beaumarchais is, I think he's about 44 when Franklin arrives. He's an effervescent, incandescent, scene-stealing playwright whom the French government have already used as a secret agent. And so in the months before Franklin gets there, France, I should back up and say, France has been watching the American colonies, anticipating some kind of revolt for almost longer than London has been watching the American colonies, anticipating some kind of revolt. They've been looking to pounce on this opportunity. And as they say early on, there are certain things at which one can connive secretly, but which one cannot finesse openly. And the perfect person to do that is Beaumarchais, whom they have employed before as a secret agent, who's known to be able to do things surreptitiously. And to him is entrusted this task of somehow secretly getting munitions to the American colonies. And that process is underway. It's a very fraught business. Some munitions are sent that are useless. The thing is done in a very disorderly fashion. But that entire provisioning process is already underway when Franklin arrives. Beaumarchais essentially passes himself, or likes to think of himself as he puts it, the agent, the apostle, and the martyr of America. He devotes himself to the American cause. And he sort of flitters around in the light that Franklin, in the illumination around Franklin, as the sort of great hero to the American cause. What he has that Franklin doesn't is great entree at Versailles. So Beaumarchais actually is able to communicate directly with the ministers at Versailles, whereas Franklin, especially before the 1778 alliance, has to keep his distance and do things through intermediaries. And that's where Beaumarchais is largely helpful.
Another of those fascinating characters who makes a brief appearance, but nevertheless, I'd like to invite you to talk a little bit about that vignette that you drop in so nicely. The meeting between Franklin and Voltaire, the aged Voltaire, whom you describe as nearly posthumous, I think. It's a wonderful phrase in a book full of wonderful phrases. And then there's that odd scene of Voltaire blessing the grandson of Franklin, William Temple Franklin, with 3 words, I believe, God and liberty in English translation. Would you be willing to talk about that scene a little bit and how that impressed you?
It's a really remarkable set piece. I mean, it sounds as if it was stage managed for the public consumption, which is indeed what ultimately will happen with it. Voltaire at this point is 84, he's decrepit. He has finally been allowed to come back after years of exile to France, essentially so that he can die in France. And he is, in early 1778, on what will essentially be his deathbed. He's at home in bed, suffering from a terrible cold, in his bathrobe and in his nightcap, when he welcomes Franklin, who brings along with him his grandson, William Temple Franklin, to see Voltaire. And this is, in the eyes of the French, the meeting of these two monuments. I mean, this is an extraordinary moment. It's as if Sophocles has suddenly materialized. And as far as we know it, because of course this account makes its way into every newspaper in Europe, the celebrated Franklin, with his grandson in tow, will approach Voltaire's bed and will ask if he will extend a blessing to the head of William Temple Franklin. It sounds so unlikely from two men who've essentially made their reputations on this very rationalist, anti-religious, sober, logical, commonsensical thinking. But there you have it. And in fact, Voltaire extends a bony hand and indeed says, "God and liberty," which I think is a motto that Temple will then use on his letters, on the stamp on his letters. It's also the phrase used at Yorktown, interestingly. But the report of this meeting of the minds, of the meeting of these two institutions, will essentially be broadcast across Europe. And it is this sort of handshake of these two luminous, almost otherworldly figures. So again, it's Franklin getting a tremendous amount of mileage out of this visit. Voltaire dies shortly thereafter. That meeting is in April. Voltaire has only weeks to live. And just before his death, someone will say to him, "Isn't this the moment to renounce Satan?" And I think Voltaire's response to that is, "This is a very poor time to be making new enemies," which tells you everything you need to know about Voltaire. While at the end of his life, someone will say to Franklin, a friend who's a cleric will say to Franklin, "Do you believe that Jesus Christ was God?" And Franklin says, "I'm going to find out soon enough." So you have two men whom you can see why there would be a temperamental affinity between these two.
Yes, and that itself is a fascinating little interchange. It's Ezra Stiles, I believe, the president of Yale, the Reverend Ezra Stiles, and longtime friends, as Franklin was with George Whitefield, and a booster of Whitefield. In fact, Franklin, paid, I believe, out of his own purse to have a structure built on what became the University of Pennsylvania, so that Whitefield could preach there. So Franklin's relationship with religion is interesting. He has those private doubts that he expresses in that letter to Stiles. And I think he asks him to burn the letter, actually, which of course he doesn't do. But again, his interest in religion is profound. And for someone who doubts, he may well doubt, but he's very clear on the fact that he believes that religion serves a very important purpose, and that all religions have, and I think this is part of the problem, he's ecumenical in his thinking, but he believes that religion itself is not only sound, but essential. Yes, one reason that he supports all of those churches and synagogues and Quaker meeting houses in and around Philadelphia. And I don't myself think that he ever doubts the existence of a God, but he has serious doubts about Christianity and its orthodox beliefs.
It's a wonderful moment in France when he tries to marry off Temple to the daughter of friends of theirs who live down the street.
Yes, this is Madame
Brion's daughter, exactly. And obviously the Brion family is Catholic and Temple is Protestant. And the Brions try to point out to Franklin that this is going to be a problem for anyone who wants to live in France and for anyone who hopes to ascend to posts which were then barred to anyone who was Protestant, to government posts which would have been barred if one were Protestant. And Franklin essentially tries to explain to them, in typical Franklinian liberal, open-minded prose, that it's just the ribbon on the pastry. The pastries are all the same. It's just, did you want it tied with a red ribbon or a blue ribbon? These differences are really inessential. Doesn't get very far with his reasoning.
Well, it occurs to me that there's another fascinating character who has a principal role to play.
Beaumarchais, I should say, had an astonishing gift for mathematics, by which I mean he could feed facts and figures to the court of Versailles, which corresponded very little to reality. So, for example, he would advertise George Washington's celebrated army of 80,000 men at a time when Washington commanded closer to 20,000 men, and he would try to convince the French court that for every million that they invested in the American colonies, it would cost Great Britain $10 million, 10 million livres in this case. So there was just this real sense of essentially trying to float this operation with what were essentially great exaggerations, if not outright lies.
You just mentioned the court, and another of these characters who has a prominent role is the Comte de Vergennes. Franklin's opposite number at Versailles, and equally subtle, I think, to Franklin, but Franklin ends up besting him somehow, and Vergennes is resentful of that. But could you talk a little bit about their relationship and Vergennes in particular?
So the Comte de Vergennes, who I think is the least remembered, most important person in this story, has been the one who has had this sort of American obsession for years. France has for years now been looking for a way to essentially seek revenge on Great Britain for much history, but for certainly the previous war. The American colonies have seemed the obvious place to locate that revenge. And Vergennes has had agents essentially circulating through the American colonies reporting back to him on how much unrest is going on in America and what London is doing about that for years. This is his shining opportunity. He is essentially, without being able to admit as much to Franklin, Franklin's greatest advocate at court. This is really in many ways Vergennes' operation, Vergennes' war. He's the one who essentially says to Beaumarchais, see what you can do about getting munitions to these Americans without letting anyone on to what you're doing. Franklin's problem initially is that he can't make contact with Vergennes. He has to go through intermediaries. Soon enough after the alliance, the two of them do meet. And it really is a sort of meeting of the minds. Vergennes is a very subtle thinker. He's an immensely diligent, sober minister, which was something sort of remarkable at the court of Versailles, and something for which he actually felt a little embarrassed. He was afraid that if people knew how many hours he worked, he would be seen as a drudge, which on some level he was. He's very much impressed by Franklin. He's very much eager to help, but his hands are somewhat tied at court. He has other ministers who don't feel as fondly toward the American cause, and he has to convince a very young king that spending all of this money on a very unproved, very disunited group of colonies is going to be worth his effort. And that's a bit of salesmanship for him, in which Franklin obviously is deeply complicit, but that's really Vergennes' doing. This is a wholesale way to seek revenge on Great Britain, to essentially fly the French flag, and to bring American commerce to French shores. That's really Vergennes' project.
And you're right to point out the uniqueness of what the Americans were up to. There had never in history been a group of colonies to break away successfully from an empire and then set up their own government. So one can see how that would be a tough sell for Vergennes at Versailles.
A very hard sell at court, not assisted by the fact that other ministers were saying this makes no mathematical sense, and by the fact that you're talking about a set of principles which could prove infectious, something no one really sees early on, and which are certainly antithetical to the ideas, obviously, of an absolute monarch.
Yes, Jacques Necker makes his appearance too, and he wasn't having it, at least initially, was he?
No, and I mean, the amounts expended here by the French court are really extraordinary. And the other ministers are constantly saying to Vergennes, your little American war is costing us quite a pretty penny. What are we getting for that? And the sad truth is that Vergennes is banking on the fact that there is a brilliant commercial future for the two countries. And within months, years of the revolution, all of American commerce has gone right back to Great Britain. So France really never benefits from that. And obviously we know the gift that we leave to France, which is essentially an empty set of coffers and then a revolution of its own.
May I ask you to engage in a little speculation by way of summing up? It's always dangerous for an historian to do that, but if you're willing, I'd like to ask if Franklin had been recalled early as a diplomat, or perhaps never been sent at all, if we'd had to rely on Silas Deane or Adams or John Jay, who comes off as very sanctimonious in the miniseries at any rate, do you think France would have allied herself with the United States? In other words, was Franklin indispensable as a diplomat in these situations?
It's a really hard thing to do, a counterfactual take. I think we can look at a couple of things. Franklin is the only American envoy who ingratiates himself at court. Pretty much everyone else stumbles along the way, manages to offend, somehow drops the ball. So Franklin, partly because of his celebrity, largely because of his patience, is able to accomplish a mission which I think would have stalled with many other with any other number of envoys. And part of that, when I say his patience, he's very old at this point. I mean, he's a man in his 70s. He's much more used to biding his time than is, for example, John Adams or John Lawrence, who at one point is sent to accomplish the same mission. So both the celebrity and the patience and I would add the finesse of spirit. I mean, this is a very subtle thinker who really does know how to make a sale. I mean, he's talked for years about how he has founded so many civic institutions through this strange alloy of leaving people without regret, pride, or envy. I mean, stewing those things together, he's able to sort of pull off impossible feats. He's never really defeated by what appears to be impossible, which I think is another secret to his success. And it's hard to imagine anyone else in that role. I mean, the celebrity alone was worth the price of admission in sending him, which Congress, by the way, doesn't entirely grasp. They think they're sending the right man. They don't know that they're sending the ideal man, because no one in Congress really understands the extent of Franklin's celebrity in Europe at this point. Franklin doesn't even entirely understand it until he arrives and lands like a meteor. So I think it's hard to sort of unthink how that could have happened. Would John Adams have muddled the matter? It obviously was of great interest for strategic reasons to the French court. If they had not had a partner with whom they could have worked, could they have pulled that off? Hard to say. Franklin plays the waiting game early on with enormous, just unbelievable finesse, because he's up against a very talented British ambassador to Paris, whom he manages to outmaneuver. It's hard to imagine someone else having figured out how to have done that. But again, it's very hard to play the counterfactual game.
Well, thank you for being speculative. And thank you very much for the book. And we're all enriched by it. And especially now, the miniseries and your role in that. And thank you for your generosity and sharing your time with us today.
Thanks for doing this, Jeff. Thanks.
Constitutional Conversations is made possible by a generous grant from the Fairleigh S. Dickinson Jr. Foundation. Constitutional Conversations is made possible by the James Madison Education Fund.